Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are today, a very warm welcome to the latest episode of our Keys webinar, our monthly broadcast to our clients all around the world. And those of you who've been with us before will know that each month we take a topic that's of interest to organisations all around the world and try and look at it from a series of different angles. And today we thought would be a good moment to rethink where we are with generations. We have a new report out for you to have a look at. I'm looking forward to those conversations. And we want to take a moment to think about how generational analysis can help us do a better job at understanding the world. We want to look at how we can unpick some of the myths from the realities. And we want to look at how we can ground our thinking in the very real demographic background and challenges that countries around the world are facing. So to help me do that, we have a wonderful panel with us today. We have Mike in London. We have Janelle in New York. We have Abimbola in Lagos. And we also have been working very closely with our colleague Priscilla in Sao Paulo, who's not able to be with us for this session, but as you'll see, her perspectives from Brazil are very much part of this session. We want your thoughts and perspectives as well, so any questions for your panelists, please put them in the box and we will try to cover them just before the end of the session. We've got some time for Q&A, otherwise we'll follow up after the webinar. And some of you may like the slides and the content that we've prepared. They'll all be sent to you tomorrow alongside a video of our presentations. So you can hopefully capture any of the insights that you like and follow up afterwards. Now, we're going to start in the UK, where the median person is 41 years old. Fertility rate is just 1.4 these days, and where we have a colleague, Mike, who has been thinking very carefully over the years about how to do a better job at understanding generations. Mike, thanks for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thanks everyone for dialing in. Yes, I've been working on generational analysis here at Ipsos since millennials were the interesting young generation, which some of us remember more fondly than others. I'm still thankfully under the median age for someone in Britain, but approaching that milestone faster than I'd like. And my job here today is to sort of remind everyone of how we think about generations here at Ipsos, the way that we look at those myths and other sorts of misconceptions that we hear about different generations, and maybe think a little bit more thoughtfully about those. And then also trail some new data we've got about life stages. I think that's probably what we're really talking about with generational analysis, how those are changing and what that means for everyone, for brands, for governments, for citizens and consumers. So if I move my slides on, one of my favorite things to do with generational analysis is to type Gen Z into Google and then do the news search and see what comes up. And I just sort of grab a couple of headlines that I saw recently from that very rigorous methodology that I use. And you can sort of see a grab bag of things that people are worried about young people doing at the moment, whether it's marrying AI or marrying older men. Or getting AI to take their jobs, or they don't care about work, it's all that sort of stuff. Our generation is now very embarrassing, apparently, though I hadn't noticed. But the idea is that people love talking about generations primarily because it gives them a chance to complain about young people, and that continues unabated despite our best efforts to get people to think a little bit more thoughtfully about it. Because what we tend to do when we think about myths or about any findings or insights that are presented to us about generations is to try and disentangle the three different effects that we're seeing, because when you see a difference between people at different ages, it will generally be due to one or a mixture of these three factors. The first one is the idea of the period effect, which is the one where a big stimulus changes everyone's opinions in the same direction broadly at the same time. So the COVID pandemic is probably the most recent example that's a good exemplar. It changed everyone's views out where it was safe to go or how much they wanted to leave the house and those sorts of things. So everyone's views change in the same way. And Simon will talk about older period effects of people of Gen X and so on, the AIDS pandemic and the impact that had on public opinion is another good example of that sort of big picture period effect. The second one, where I want to focus briefly today, is on life cycle effects, because people go through life stages that other people have been through before, whether that's going to university, starting a job, having a child, buying a house, retiring. These change your outlook and your interests and your well-being in many ways, in ways that if they're not predictable, at least we can think about in a way that isn't unprecedented. And then finally, at the top, you have the cohorts effect, which is what all those headlines are trying to get at, suggesting there's something unique about this generation that will stay with it as it ages. And generally, obviously, it's somewhere in the middle in those overlapping parts of the Venn diagram rather than at the top. And just by thinking about these different questions, you can begin to unpick some of the myths that we see. But actually, what I also found in my searches is that baby boomers aren't getting off lightly either when it comes to news about them. And actually, maybe some of these myths are just as damaging, if not more damaging, to how we think about our society. So the idea of them holding all the wealth or holding all the housing or not being able to use technology is very prevalent. And maybe actually these myths are ones we should be thinking about too. And I say that because actually I think when we ask people how many people in their society are aged 18 or under, they're actually pretty good at guessing. So we have a sense of how many young people there are in our society. You can see the scatter plot, which puts the actual proportion of people in each country who are under 18 with what our survey told us. And it's actually quite a close correlation. So the younger countries like South Africa and the Philippines, much more, say there's a larger proportion of younger people. And at the other end, you have Japan, South Korea, and Italy. And the average absolute error is only 4 points. But when we ask the same question about the over 35s, there's no relationship at all. People just pick a figure somewhere between 20 and 30%, regardless of the actual situation. So in Japan, they say as many people in their societies are old as they say in Indonesia, which obviously is not true. And that speaks to perhaps that these myths about older people are coming from a position of a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding, which is a little bit more concerning perhaps when we think about the way that our society is aging. And what we find in this survey as well is that, that underlying that is the sense that the point at which you become old hasn't changed. So back 7 years ago in 2018, we asked people, oh, what age do you think, someone becomes old? And that was 67. And in the new data we have this year, it's exactly the same. And actually in some countries it's declined. So even though the world ages, the median age of the world increases about a quarter of a year every year, the age at which people think you are old hasn't changed at all over that period. And that exposes the tension I wanted to get everyone to think about for this session, which is that even as our life expectancy is increasing and many of the life stages that people go through, whether that's owning a home, having a child, gradually creeping upwards, our perceptions of when is the right time to do those things is not keeping up. And that opens quite a big tension in society between when people expect to reach certain stages of their life, or when people are expected to do so, more importantly for younger people, and when they actually will. So we went into a bit more detail there, thinking about Gen Z. So currently Gen Z is everyone aged 30 and under, effectively all adults aged under 30. And they've had quite a comparatively relaxed couple of years. People talk about their sort of interest in materialism and not having too much to tie them down. But what we see is that they're approaching a period of some very compressed expectations. So the age at which over the 32 countries is the ideal age to get married is 28. The age at which is the best time to buy a first house is 30. And having a child is pretty much the same age. So this generation is most of them just behind these milestones. But you can imagine as over the next couple of years, they reach these points and expectations begin to change. It could mean quite a lot of difference for Gen Z. So, that clash of expectations and reality, their own as well as others. The impact of these major life cycle changes, which we know change people's outlook on their attitudes. And also the idea of, not caring that much about taking it easy, the nouveau nihilism that we explore in our other work might be put to the test. Skipping over the millennials towards Gen X, who are in their sort of late 50s to early 60s broadly, they're obviously approaching that figure that people said is the age at which you're considered to be old. And that poses some other challenges, I guess, as you begin to change your view of yourself. So, this generation is many of the leaders and decision makers in big companies and governments around the world today. So that preoccupation with aging and awareness of that fact and how they're being perceived as changing is something that will become front of mind as we go further towards 2030, and maybe there are different focuses on health and beauty and defying stereotypes in a way that we hadn't seen before that might be come to the fore. And then, of course, for the baby boomers who are now in their 60s into their 70s, they're beginning to approach this slightly more serious milestone when we ask people how old you expect to live to be at 78. And we already saw from the headlines there's a lot of talk about inheritance and passing wealth down from this, in many countries, particularly in Europe, a very, very rich generation. Those sorts of questions are increasingly coming to the fore as people think about what that means for our societies, how they spend down their assets, what they want to do with them. And also, I think they're a different generation. They're not expected to sort of fade into the background in a way that in your head, traditionally older people might, when actually they're a very culturally, politically, and economically hefty generation that will be around for a long time still. So that's my brief exploration of our new data and talking a bit about how we think about generations. My 3 key points to leave you with. One is that it's usually not generational. So we see lots of the headlines. The drivers are typically not about generation, but more about life stage and some period effects as well. The second thing is that we need to talk about this tension because I think it's going to become much more significant as we go through the rest of this decade. We begin to see the signs now, but as our society continues to age and our culture doesn't keep up, that's going to become an increasingly big issue. And finally, in a way, it's reassuring because we know what these issues they might face are because people have been through these life stages before. So when you think about helping generations out, it's not that there's new stuff to do, it's the same challenges, but maybe with a new spin. And that can help us all to think about how we can help people navigate what's coming up in the future. And with that, I'll pass back to Simon.
Well, thank you for that, Mike. And I'm very struck by your point about the Gen Z and the or Gen Z, depending on what you prefer, and the sense that you one could perhaps cut and paste what was being written about millennials 15 years ago, put it into our narrative now, and job done. So that's quite a reminder for us. So thank you for your advice. Is there one particular piece of advice you'd really want to have us put in the back or indeed the front of our minds as we think about how to do a better job here?
I think, it's probably the first point everyone can see on the slide, which is that it's not normally generational. I mean, there's lots of areas where I think talking about generations can be counterproductive. I think in the workplace, particularly, where life stage is actually really, really important, it can lead to some divisive conversations that aren't necessary. So I think almost anywhere, if we're talking about generations, the key thing for me is to dig in a little bit and look at some other hypotheses first before we say something is unique to Generation Z or the baby boomers or wherever it might be.
Okay, that's a good point. So not use it might be our end point, but maybe it shouldn't be our starting point. Okay, thank you for that. If you're very eagle-eyed, you'll notice also on Mike's slide, his point 2 talked about cultural understanding, and Janelle's going to help us with that in just a moment. We're going to the US, where the average age is a little bit lower, fertility rate is a little bit higher, and where there are many things to think about. Thank you, Janelle, for your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you today. I love discussing anything to do with people, markets, and society, and generations is actually one of my favorite aspects of identity to discuss in the US. We firmly believe this is one of many important aspects of audience understanding, and that no group is a monolith. And so, like Mike, I appreciate taking a look at what's in the news to get to ground myself in understanding the topic at hand. And I love what I found when I started looking for generational understanding in the US. What's being said in the news is not really different than what Mike shared, but also really excited to see that there's conversation about Generation Beta, because 2025 is the start of that year or that generation. And what we're seeing in the news in the US in terms of generational understanding is that it's particularly a key resource for marketers and for employers, and understanding how to influence or inspire workers and consumers. This is particularly interesting, using generational understanding as an opportunity for connection and segmenting people. It's particularly interesting because the US is the largest group of consumers. And so we can see these generational differences are sometimes interesting and helpful, but this understanding of how different those differences are is pervasive even when it's not accurate. And so the next slide really focuses on some of those differences that we're seeing. This set of headlines, while really emphasize that generational differences are often exaggerated in marketing and lead to stereotypes, lead to lack of nuanced understanding of consumer behavior. And so while it can be a helpful starting point to understand generations, it's really important not to rely solely on them because we can perpetuate some inaccuracies and miss opportunities to truly connect with consumers and other audiences. And what's even more fascinating is how Gen Z specifically, because it's so different from many of the earlier generations in the US, is appending that understanding and really pushing on what we understand. And so averages can't tell the story, right? One of the things that's fascinating in the US is that even when I got into this business, and I'll say I'm older than the average in the US, I'm also older than the average in the UK. But what's fascinating is when I started in, the advertising and the market research business, how much in the US we would refer to the general market as if there was an average person or an average way to be. And what we're seeing today, decades later, is that there really isn't an average, and that definitely doesn't tell the full story. And Gen Z is pushing on that in some very interesting ways. The US population is dynamic and evolving. And while the overall population grew slowly since 2000, and many years that growth rate was even under 0.5%, many segments in the US are outpacing growth of the overall country. And represent greater proportions of who's in Gen Z and even younger generations. And an example is what you're seeing on this slide here. So just looking at US racial and ethnic groups, we see a very different story in terms of what's happening. With the Black population in the US, in the last 2 decades, they grew over 30%. And what's fascinating about this group is that as a total, it's about 48 million people. That's larger than the number of people in Canada, for perspective. The US Asian population is also very interesting. They grew over 100% in the last 2 decades. So moving from about 11 million to over 24 million people in that 20-year time period. And what's even fascinating about the dynamics of that group is how high the household income is compared to the rest of the country, compared to the average. And so you can see that their average household income is $112,000 a year versus $80,000 a year for the overall average. And the US Hispanic population, also very interesting, also very fast growing, and grew over 80% in the last 2 decades. And what's really fascinating about them is just their purchasing power and how it's advancing, partially due to size and partially due to, as a group, getting more opportunities. So when we look at their GDP, if they were a standalone country, they would be the 5th largest GDP in the world, which is larger than the UK and France, for example. So very interesting dynamics. And you can see, because these groups are more highly represented in Gen Z, it's really pushing on our understanding in a number of interesting ways. Now, we've done a lot of research on Gen Z, and one of the things that we see with any group, including this group, is that it's important to understand the cohorts within the generation. It's important to understand the different sort of identity groups because it helps us to truly capture need states and jobs to be done, whether we're looking at consumers or whether we're looking at employees. And so as we look at Gen Z, one of the things that we're seeing is that race and ethnicity is important. So while the overall population is about 40% people of color, in Gen Z, it's 50% people of color. And in some states like California, it's even as high as 60% people of color. Gender and sexuality are important in Gen Z because they're the most gender fluid and most sexually fluid generation. So you see incidences of, for instance, people in the LGBTQ plus community where it might be 7% in the overall population, it's around 15% in Gen Z. Ability is also a really interesting identity marker. 25% of the US has some sort of visible or non-visible disability. Gen Z is not only more willing to embrace differences and different abilities, but also is seen as having a mental health crisis and really addressing and putting forth mental health challenges in a way that other generations don't. Nationality is also really interesting. 29% of Gen Z are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. And then when we look at income or class, Gen Z tends to be more frugal. Many of you may know Gen Zers that are thrifters and love thrifting, but they have lower purchasing power than a lot of other generations did at the same age. And so, and that's driven by many things. For instance, income inequality in the US is greater than it's ever been. So you can see how these different factors or different aspects of identity can really inform consumer behavior in more nuanced ways than just an understanding of generation. What complicates the situation even more is our views on aging are also shifting. And while there's an understanding of what is considered older, and that may not shift, but how it's portrayed is shifting. And so this is one of my favorite slides because we see a comparison of two shows that I absolutely love and still watch both of them. Golden Girls is a TV series in the US from 1985 to 1992 that was on air. And the characters outside of Sophia, the characters on this show at the time were ages 47 to 55. Whereas the sequel to Sex and the City and Just Like That, those characters are ages 55 and 54. So you can see that they look younger and more vibrant, even though they're portraying an older age cohort than the Golden Girls. And this is something that we see in many ways. The perception of aging in the US has shifted towards a later perceived onset of old age and a trend of more positive views of aging, particularly among older adults. Next up, one of the things I really wanted to share with this quickly is the wheel of power and privilege. So as we do this work in terms of understanding audiences from a generational and other perspectives, this is a really interesting tool. I discovered it a few years ago, and it shows how different aspects of identity can be empowered or marginalized in a society. And while it's not exhaustive, and it features 12 dimensions of identity, it's helpful as a tool for building empathy because it enables two things. One, I think everyone can look at this chart and see ways in which they are empowered and ways in which they are marginalized. Also, it's a great starting point for conversation that we're all more than one thing, and who we are and our identities impact how we navigate society, and it can converge and impact our privilege. And so the key headline there is ensuring that groups aren't viewed as a monolith allows us to really be more actionable when we're able to be more nuanced in our understanding. And this understanding, I think I skipped 2 slides, this understanding really influences how we think about cultural intelligence in the US, how we think about generations. So usually when we're given the task to illuminate a particular audience, we make sure we're trying to understand different cohorts within it. So if we're asked to illuminate Gen Z, we make sure that there are interesting things that we can share with other aspects of identity to ensure that we're not portraying them in a very monolithic way. And then in summary, my 3 points: generational differences provide valuable context. However, no group is a monolith. And identifying these key cohorts really provide critical nuance that are important for connection. I'll pass it back to you, Simon.
Well, thank you, and thank you for compellingly kind of unpicking this point around how we generalize about generations at our peril. And just to pick up on the point you started with around there's no such thing as a general consumer, and perhaps a particular question on behalf of those of us who are based outside the US. But
yes.
Does this mean that there are more studies in the US which maybe are more targeted than trying to do the country as a whole? How's that evolved over the period you've been
It's a
working?
great question. I think generally in the requests that we get from our client partners, everyone's looking for a representative understanding of who is in the country. And so that in and of itself will trigger the inclusion of a lot of other groups. We also have clients asking for very specific things, like knowing that they want to understand what's happening within the Hispanic population or what's happening within the Asian population or Black population or, generational. Will often get requests to boost or enhance or overrepresent a certain segment of the population to make sure that regardless of the sample size, we're seeing those differences. The other thing that's interesting is because the US is large and very different regionally and by state, we will focus research depending on what's interesting for our clients. So for instance, they might be interested in looking at certain states like Florida or Texas because of the growth and the differences that are happening there. So it really varies, but everyone's really looking with an eye towards representation and making sure that they see the diversity of who our current and future consumers are in the US.
We're now going to a country with similar population, much higher fertility rate, as you can see at 4.3, much lower median age. Abimbola, thank you for the work you've been doing to help us think through the power of demographics and help us think through some of the dynamics at work. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Simon. Thank you for having me. I'll need one help from you. The slides are a bit slow from over here, so I'll need you to help with that so I can talk through the slides. Okay, thank you, Mike. That was quite insightful from there. I'll go straight into the Nigeria slides, okay? So Nigeria's current population represents 3% of the total world population, with high fertility rate of an average of 4.3 births per woman. Okay, looking at the demographic destinies, I'll say today we will be looking at the demographic distribution across generations, energy, aspiration, and challenges. So the demographic splits in Nigeria, we can see that more than half of the Nigeria's population falls under the Generation Z and Generation Alpha. As you can see, it's highlighted here in the slide yellow. So we have more than half generation falling in between the Generation Alpha and then Generation Z. So Nigeria is still a young and growing nation. The young populace in Nigeria are full of energy with lots of potentials in today's evolving markets. However, to harness this energy, it is important that we address the dynamic and the complex situation which keeps the Nigerian young population awake on a daily basis. Okay, some of the in the multitude of the challenges that we see here in Nigeria today, I think I would like to highlight 4 major challenges that if we can address in Nigeria on the front of the government or organization, it will go a long way in making Nigeria a better place. So I would say one of the challenges is the challenging economy that we face currently in Nigeria, the hostile macros leaving us with high inflation rates in Nigeria. Secondly, I would like to talk about the young citizens' energy and their quest for better governance. They've been involved in intense demonstration via social media and other public platforms where they can make their voice to be heard. And thirdly, I would like to go into the engaging women. The young women in Nigeria today are very aspirational, very competitive, and less hierarchical. So if we can involve this set of people in the decisions and policy making, both in organization leadership role or in the public sphere, in the government ends of affair, it will be a very great one to do to help to buttress the future of the country. And then lastly, I would like to mention about the rural environment. As much as the rural and the urban areas have commonalities, we will see that the rural environment development is quite slower than what we have currently in the urban environment. So our young citizens are challenging the norms, the traditional norms that are happening currently in Nigeria today. So if we can listen to them, it will be a better place for us in Nigeria. Then I would like to mention, I would like to go to the slide where we have the generation terms and usage. So although generation terminologies are not vastly used in Nigeria, except for the Generation Z. With Generation Z, everyone, even the old generation, going to the silent generation, they understand what Generation Z are. And this is basically because of their mindset, their attitudes, the way they react to things, the way they react to information, how they consume information. And it's a good note to know that each of these generation individuals experience generation across different generations differently. Okay, the generation C is the perception in Nigeria is that they do not have to have the Western education before they can become success in Nigeria. Reason is because of possibly the lack of job or insecurity in jobs. So they believe that they have to acquire other skills like content creation, like fashion and other things to be able to ensure that they are able to meet up with their financial obligation. Okay, and then the local context, we can see that understanding the trends in Nigeria is also similar to what we are also seeing internationally. So there is some sort of similarities between what we see here within the generations Z and Alpha and what we also see in other international countries. So in summary, and to my final slide, I would like to say, in order for us to be able to drive sustainable growth in Nigeria, it would be great that we drive, we boost growth in Nigeria by ensuring that we keep to the essential positive energy of the young youths, young citizens of Nigeria, the women, the leveraging the power and the leadership skills of the women that we have in Nigeria. Also ensuring that we involve in the tech skills that our youth are currently using now in Nigeria, and also ensure that we continue to allow, promote growth in education and other infrastructure in the rural area. Thank you. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Simon, and Simon, you can take it from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, but I'm going to give it straight back to you again, because that was a brilliant tour of the patterns, the trends, and indeed some of the cultural reference points, and really struck by your reminder that some of these terms aren't necessarily being used everywhere. Gen Z maybe, baby boomers, which of course, remember, baby booms happened at different times, maybe not so much. So I think it's a really good reminder about the cultural transferability or not of some of the terms. But I had one question for you, because it comes up on a number of your slides about women, the role of women, and what's your sense of how women's role in shaping the direction of the country as it moves forward?
Okay, thank you, Simon. The role of women in Nigeria cannot be underestimated now. Within the young generation, you can see that the women are taking lead in so many places today, both in the public space, in the politics, and also in organization. In every organization in Nigeria today, you see women climbing the ladder of leadership, And we see that if we encourage women and give them this opportunity, Nigeria will be a better place in the nearest future.
Lovely, thank you. And questions, remember, put them in the chat box. Any questions for Abimbola or anybody on the panel, we'll come back to them at the end. Thank you, Abimbola. We'll be back with you before we finish the webinar. We're going to be going to Brazil shortly, because Priscilla and I have been doing some work together on thinking about the context of people's lives, and in particular about the context of where and when we were born and indeed grew up. So in our new report, which we'll be sharing with you after the webinar, we'll be looking particularly at Generation X and a group of people who, of course, grew up in the 1980s. Indeed, I grew up in the 1980s in Britain, and at that time, just to rewind, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were two of our political reference points in power for pretty much all of that decade. We watched on TV the famine in Ethiopia. We then watched on TV, along with nearly 2 billion other people, the Live Aid concerts on the world stage. We saw the arrival of AIDS, and this government communication in the UK reached almost everybody by a combination of billboards, TV advertising, and newspaper adverts. The communications environment being a little bit different at that time. The Berlin Wall, of course, which was built before we were born, came crashing down. So that was the 80s. As we went into the 90s, more reference points that we experienced, let's say as we reached adulthood, around technology, around tensions, the first series of Friends, not the on replay as it seems to be now, World Cup triumphs for France, and the soundtrack, a global soundtrack of Celine Dion and Nirvana, two of the biggest selling ones in Britain. Oasis, coming back this year, also did very well. You'll also notice, if you're a student of soccer, that Brazil also won a World Cup during this period. And Priscilla, we've been thinking about this a little bit because the experience of Gen X in Brazil is both similar and different at the same time. Over to you, Priscilla.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for reminding the World Cup triumph. It's been a while, indeed. So I'm going to talk about Gen X in Brazil. I am a millennial, but I'll do my best. And I know I can rely on data, so everything's going to be all right, I guess. So just a quick reminder of what Simon was saying. I want to show you that, and I want to start by saying that all of these global events in the 80s and the 90s, they were also very important to shape Generation X minds and hearts in Brazil. So we are talking about political events, economic events, but also cultural events in the movies and in the music, as I brought here. But of course, there are country-specific contexts that you can imagine are very important to shape Generation X in Brazil and also in Latam. So I would like to remind you, for example, that during the 80s, we were living under a military dictatorship in Brazil and also in other countries in Latin America. So of course, this is a very different context from Europe and United States. And also at the same time, Brazil and Latam were living under hyperinflation context that led to a stagnation, of course. So if you lived in Brazil in 1985, for example, and if you go to a supermarket, you would see that prices changed on a daily basis, not for one or two products, but the entire supermarket had to change prices of the products every day. So this led Brazilians and authorities to name the decade of the 80s as the lost decade in Brazil. So hyperinflation here is not just a fact, it's actually a Brazilian trauma. So as you can see, this is very important to think of how Generation X grew up in the 80s and how they can think of life nowadays. So Generation X is characterized by a strong need of stability in many ways, political stability and of course economic stability. So now in 2025, 8 out of 10 people from Generation X thinks that democracy is the ideal governance system. 2/3 of them agree that success is measured by the things that they own, and only 1/3 of Generation X in Brazil think that it's too late to do anything about the climate change. And they are, in this sense, more optimistic than the younger generations in Brazil. Maybe because they are a generation that saw life, big transformations in the social front and the environmental front, for example. Moving forward, Generation X in Brazil, they tend to be less open to global brands and marketing messages than the younger generations. That does not mean that they don't like global brands or they don't accept messages. It's just that they are less open to these brands when we compare to Gen Z, for example, in Brazil. So 55% of Gen X in Brazil agree that they are willing to spend an extra for a brand with an image that appeals to them. And only 46% of them think that global brands make better products than local brands. So that's an interesting difference when we compare both generations. But I want to bring here an important data about technology, because Gen X, they are not so open to global brands, but they are as enthusiastic as Generation Z about the benefits of technology. And this is a regional trace. In Latam, for example, people tend to be more enthusiastic in a positive way about technology, and that's a different reality if we see, for example, Europe or the United States. So both people from Generation X and Z, they think that modern technology can solve future problems, and they have a positive view, the majority of them, about artificial intelligence. But just moving forward to 2025, I want to bring again some demographic data and to talk about demographic transformations that are impacting our lives nowadays and are impacting lives regarding elections, regarding the way people celebrate holidays, for example, Carnival, and the way people are consuming and even making exercises. And I'm talking about the religion shift that Brazil is facing. We were once a Catholic country, but now we are seeing this changing. So in a few years, we are becoming a mostly evangelical country. So as I said, this impacts a lot of things, especially the way people consume products. And the other demographic change I would like to stress here is about the age shift. So maybe some of you may think of Brazil as a young country, but we are not that young anymore. So we are getting older faster than many other developed countries. So with this panorama, I leave us with questions and thoughts that we can discuss together. One of these thoughts is if brands are actually looking for the right things and trends and tips of how consumers' minds are being shaped locally, and if we are thinking of generations beyond stereotypes, and which of demographic shifts are really impacting brands. So this is with me, Simon. I'll get back to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And your Generation X versus Z thing is, I think, really powerful, because it reminds us, perhaps, or starts to give us some thoughts about the kinds of areas where you might do more tailored messaging, but also those things that are a bit more universal around technology. Your points about religion reminded me of that. I think we're going to come back to that in a future Keys webinar. It's potentially under-researched and under-talked about its role in different countries around the world. I've got one question, just to pick up on that point you said about how quickly Brazil's demography has changed. Now it's like the United States, pretty much. Mm-hmm. Is that something that's being discussed in the business world? I mean, is this a big topic of conversation?
Yes, it is. It is. We see these kind of conversations in many kinds of industries. So in our industry, market research, it's a very important trend, and we are discussing this with clients. So we start to see like cases in the cosmetic industry, service industry, finance industry, of how can we make the most of the older generations, how can they can come back to the workplace, So that's one kind of discussion that we are seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this whole sense, and again, topics for have more discussions around in terms of how we adapt, what it means for workplace, what it means for consumers, and indeed how we can better understand different groups, which is something Janelle, I know, has been researching very in a very focused way. I'm hoping the sound works, Janelle, so I'm crossing my fingers and I'm crossing them and sending them over the Atlantic to New York. Over to you.
I'm crossing my fingers as well,
Brilliant.
so hopefully everyone can hear me. So such a pleasure to join you today. I love discussing anything related to people, markets, and society, and generations is one of my favorite aspects of identity, though in the US, we firmly believe it's one of many important aspects of audience understanding and that no group is a monolith. So hopefully my slide advances. There we go. Oh, and we're gonna go back. Okay, so like Mike, I love looking at what's in the news to better understand a topic on what's being said, and generations is no different. It's a hot topic today, even in recent weeks, because 2025 is the official start of Generation Beta. And what we're seeing in the news is that generational understanding is particularly a key resource for understanding consumption and employment dynamics. So this is a tool often marketers are using heavily and employers are using heavily. And it's often an interesting predictor of US behavior, though not the only one. So it's interesting to see what many of these headlines suggest. It's about connection, it's about opportunity, and segmenting people so that you can influence them. So you can see a lot of these great headlines here, which are particularly fascinating with US consumers being, US citizens being the largest consumers in the globe, and how pervasive generational differences can be, even if they're not always accurate. So on the next slide, what I love about what we're also seeing in the news is another set of headlines, that generational differences are often exaggerated in marketing, leading to stereotyping, a lack of nuanced understanding of consumer behavior. And while generational segmentation can be a useful starting point, relying solely on these labels can really perpetuate some inaccurate assumptions and miss opportunities for true connection. And Gen Z is really upending how we think about generations and generational understanding, because they are so different. So you might be wondering, how different are they in the US? And the key thing or headline there is that averages can't tell the full story, right? One of the things that's interesting when I started in advertising and research is there was always a reference to the general market. And one of the things that we can say, particularly looking at Gen Z, is that there is no general market in the US. The default consumer doesn't really exist, because the reality is we're all more than one thing, and there's so many aspects to identity to consider. So here are some of the details that are interesting that really highlight how dynamic and evolving the US population is, and how a lot of that manifests in Gen Z. While the overall population grew very slowly since 2000, and in some years that growth rate might be as low as 0.5%, many segments of the US population are growing much greater, and we can really see that in Gen Z. And right now, what you see on this slide is just a look at some of the racial and ethnic segments in the US, which often gets talked about. So wanted to give you a sense for the dynamics of those groups in particular. So remember, I said the US overall population growth rate is moving very slowly, but the US Black population grew over 30% in the last 2 decades, right? One interesting factor to think about that group, it's about 48 million people, which is larger than everyone in Canada. So very large population, and sometimes it will get overlooked in terms of its size just because it's within the US. When we look at the US Asian population, they grew over 100% in the last 2 decades. That's from about 11 million to over 24 million. One of the interesting things about that group that's really interesting when we think about consumer behavior is that they have the highest household income across racial and ethnic groups in the US. So the overall average is about $80,000 a year, whereas for the Asian population, that is $112,000 average household income a year. And when we look at the US Hispanic population, in the last 2 decades, they grew over 80%. They represent the largest racial and ethnic group in the US. And interestingly, if we look at their GDP as a standalone country, it would be the 5th largest GDP in the world. That's larger than the UK, that's larger than France and many other countries. So it's really interesting to see how these groups as standalone audiences are really interesting to contend with as we think about the overall dynamics in the US. So how does this really play out with Gen Z? My slides are advancing faster than I am. Give me one moment. So we see critical things with regards to Gen Z. One of the things that we love to do when we're asked to illuminate a particular audience is we'll take that, assignment or that opportunity. For instance, help me understand Gen Z, help me understand lower income consumers, help me understand Black consumers. And we'll always endeavor to look at the key cohorts within that group by various aspects of identity. And what's fascinating in everything that we're learning is that these intersecting aspects can really help also inform behavior in a number of ways. It really captures need states and jobs to be done. So when we look at Gen Z, for instance, half of Gen Z are people of color in the US. And in some states like California, it's as high as 60%. So you can imagine many of the issues or opportunities or challenges that people of color are facing as individual groups are even more pronounced in Gen Z. When we look at gender and sexuality within Gen Z is the most gender and sexually fluid generation. So that also impacts need states and jobs to be done. When we look at generation and ability, Gen Z is not only willing to embrace different abilities, but they're also seen as having a mental health crisis and more willing to talk about things like anxiety and depression than other generations are. When we look at generation and nationality, 29% of Gen Zers are immigrants or the children of immigrants. So their perspective on the world stage is very interesting and often more dynamic than earlier generations. When we look at generation and income, Gen Z often tends to be more frugal and has lower purchasing power. And there's no surprise there because baby boomers at the same age, primarily due to rising costs of living, housing, tuition, basically wage growth is not outpacing the overall growth. And so while Gen Z may have higher incomes overall than previous generations at their age, the increased costs really have given them less purchasing power, and there's even greater income inequality at this moment. So the other thing that is interesting and complicates our understanding is our perception of aging in the US is also changing. And so while the overall population is aging and people are living longer, what we see in the media often reflects a very interesting story. The images that I have here are really fun ones. These are both shows that I absolutely love, and I still watch Golden Girls in syndication. But what's fascinating about these characters, and just like that is the sequel to Sex and the City, is that these characters are the same age, or roughly the same age. In fact, and just like that series, the characters are ages 54 and 55, whereas the Golden Girls, the characters are ages 47 to 55. So in fact, they're even younger, and the way they're being portrayed is older, right? Not a wrinkle or a gray hair in sight with the current programming. And so this perception of aging in the US has shifted towards a later perceived onset of old age in terms of how that's presented, with a trend of more positive views on aging, particularly among older adults. One of the things that's really steadfast in my mind is seeing celebrities like Madonna or Demi Moore or Halle Berry looking absolutely fantastic and oftentimes much younger than they did when they were actually younger. And also how they are embracing old age is very different, even though how they look is much younger than what we've seen in the past. So this is a very interesting thing that complicates our understanding. The next thing I just want to touch on really briefly is many of you may not be familiar with this. It's called the Wheel of Power and Privilege, and it's a tool that I discovered a few years ago that shows how different aspects of identity can be empowered or marginalized in a society. And while it's not exhaustive, And this features 12 dimensions and doesn't include things like race. It's a helpful tool for building empathy as it enables two things. The first is that most people can look at this diagram and see that they are more than one thing, right? They can see that in which ways they are empowered and which ways they are marginalized. The second thing that I really love about this is that it really allows us to have a conversation about how we can be more than one thing at one time, something we're calling intersectional identity in the US. And it's really a great tool for ensuring that groups aren't viewed as a monolith and solving some challenges with some actionable insight. And this tool has really informed how we think about cultural intelligence in the US, how we think about having more expansive audience understanding in the US. And you can see the 6 areas of cultural intelligence that we typically focus on when we're looking to illuminate underserved or just overall audiences. So race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, socioeconomics, nationality, life stage, and ability, which is exactly how we illuminated Gen Z in that past slide. So with that, I will wrap up and hopefully my slides will build accordingly. Key things to remember: generational differences provide valuable context. However, no group is a monolith. And identifying key cohorts within any group provides critical nuance that can inform any number of things. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Janelle. I keep looking at that Golden Girls Sex and the City slide because, as you say, I think at least one of them is 60 this year from the Sex and the City series. What I wrote down just at the beginning was the default consumer doesn't exist, and just to help those of us who aren't based in America. I mean, what are you seeing now? Are you seeing clients maybe not always doing a US-wide sample? Are they being more targeted and focused? Are you observing any patterns these days?
Yeah, we're seeing a variety of different things. And so while oftentimes people will still use the terminology, general market or total sample or national sample, they're really also looking for a true representation or an accurate representation of who is in these various markets. So oftentimes that will be layered with a focus on particular states, which will give you a certain level of diversity. There's more diversity in places like, New York and California and Florida and even Texas than you might find in some other places. We also try to balance rural and urban areas because that will give you a different perspective on diversity and so many aspects of it. Not only race and even age, but socioeconomics are very different between urban and rural areas. There sometimes we'll have with clients, they will literally request that we boost up a certain aspect of the population in a certain way so that the data is more reflective of particular issues in a particular group or segment. And oftentimes that's really important because when we look at these underserved and fast growing audiences, what often works for them works for everyone. I haven't really figured out the best term for that, but really it's the lowest common denominator, right? If we are all Americans, if we solve issues for those that are least, represented or most underserved or contending with a number of different challenges, we're solving the issues for everyone. And this is one of the reasons that we even like looking at people with disabilities. One of the things I'm always fascinated by is, how our communication has changed today, and we're all using, virtual communication and video chat. This was developed for people who are deaf because they couldn't talk on the phone, right? And so this is a technology that we've all benefited from, even though it was created for a particular group. So we're seeing a mix of different things to get that diversity within our samples.
Okay, well, fantastic. I'm glad our technology was able to bring you back. So thank you so much, Janelle. I've got time for 3 quick questions for each of my colleagues. I'm going to come to Abimbola first, and then Priscilla, then Mike. Abimbola, I've got a question about noting the big changes taking place in society and the energy that you talked about. what's happening in the food and beverages sector? Any advice for us on how that's changing or evolving in response to trends on the ground? So you're on mute. Okay, so I think we're now on mute with Abimbola. So we'll follow up on that question with our client separately. I'm going to come to you, Priscilla, which is the slide you mentioned about Brazil not being so much of a Catholic country as it was, and evangelical, let's say, being on the rise. Are we seeing anything in terms of behaviours out there among Brazilian citizens and consumers as a result of these societal changes?
Yes, well, the first thing to remind is using what Janelle just showed us, no group is a monolith. So it's very important to say that Catholics are different between them and evangelicals are also very different between them. But as a group, we can see, of course, differences in the way they vote, in the way they celebrate life, as I said before, and maybe the way they consume products. But this is because, of course, in their foundation, philosophically speaking, is different. Okay, if you see Catholic principles and evangelical principles, they are a little bit different. So this, of course, can explain why there are some differences around between these two groups. This is a still ongoing thing to be explored in Brazil.
Yeah.
One of the hypotheses here is that evangelicals are a little bit more conservative than Catholics or less progressive than Catholics with regards politics or, for example, consumption of alcohol and alcoholic beverages. So I think the major differences are related to these costumes or values subjects.
No, well, thank you for flagging it because it adds to the picture. And one of the things we also talk about in our report, coming back to the no group is a monolith point, is around Gen Z men and Gen Z women and what we're finding on attitudes there. But still needs a lot more. It's still a very complex topic, and I think evolving. And again, even within Gen Z men, Gen Z women, you have to be careful about overgeneralizing. So thank you for flagging that. I'm going to finish my questions with Mike. Your survey has piqued the interest of one or two people. Is there anything else you spotted in this survey that you've done that you'd like to share while we're all together today? Oh no, we're losing the sound of Mike as well, I think. No, we're losing the sound there as well. No, I think, well, I can't hear Mike, and we are up on the air. What we will do to our viewers on the call is we'll add a bonus slide with Mike's extra nugget that he would have liked to include about that survey, because what I know Mike's tried to do is really take the temperature of how people feel about aging these days, and it connects with some of the things that Janelle was pulling out in particular. So I'm sorry we couldn't hear from Mike, but we'll ask him to write down and give us a bonus slide for you all to take away when we send it over tomorrow. So thank you everybody for being with us today. I hope you weren't too distracted by a little bit of technological toing and throwing, but wonderful presentations. Thank you to the team for pulling all of this together and your perspectives, and it builds on more that we've done in the report, which includes perspectives from other parts of the world, including China, for example, and South Korea. So we try to bring in a whole range of perspectives in the report, and we've also tried to bring in some points of view from other Ipsos experts and colleagues. So there are a couple of white papers that partner the report. One of them is looking at how we can understand and segment those older groups of consumers. Another one is provoking us to think about, a bit like where Janelle was talking, where we can just break the stereotypes and think about some of the universal needs that we have. So I do hope some of the resources will be useful to you in your own work. As I mentioned, we'll have all of this available for you tomorrow, so look out for that in your inbox, and join us also a month or so, or 4 weeks from today, when we will be looking at tech acceleration and trying to think through what that means for how we live our lives, how we bring new products to market, and how we can make sure we all stay ahead of the game. So looking forward to that. Thank you everybody for being with us on the call, and thank you to, of course, to our wonderful panel, and we'll see you again soon. All the very best.